One common thing between the two was is we pluck a note and it dies immediately. We want to speak on our instruments rather than sing or shout. Music is nothing but an artificial language through which we seek to acquaint the listener with our musical ideas. My name's Nigel North, and you may know me as a lute player, and this is my 13-course Baroque lute. Regarding what we're going to chat about today, I also played the violin as a kid, and classical and electric guitar, and so all of those different worlds have added to how I can approach music, particularly in the ideas of how to phrase and how to articulate. Today's talk with some music is called Common Ground, and it's come about that for the last few decades I've had the pleasure of visiting guitar festivals and doing masterclasses with guitarists, and I often found myself describing what we do on the lute next to what we do on the guitar as being almost the same, and sometimes we don't hear the differences. And I came up with an image myself of there being two planets, and you can look at them both in the sky. They look exactly the same from here. Let's say they're both the world, and then if we approach one and then the other, we see little differences, like the color of the sea may be different, the height of the trees, and so on. And when I've worked with wonderful guitar players, it's more a question of just noticing the differences, and you can choose how you want to play, of course. But those of us sort of in what's called today the historically informed world, we work with copies of original instruments. We've read various books, which are not so many for the lute, about how to play, what the approach was. And that's what I'd like to share. What's the fundamental difference about being on the lute planet as opposed to being on the guitar planet? But they're both musical. The first thing, the subject that always used to frighten me, because I didn't actually understand it, was rhetoric. Bruce Haynes, in his book called The End of Early Music, says we should throw away early music as a term and just use rhetorical music. But rhetoric is such an important part of how we make music and how they made music in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. And I'd like to start by just taking a little time to explain what that was. These days, sadly, we think of rhetoric in bad terms, politicians and lawyers. But there's something of the essence there. In fact, that's how it started. So rhetoric goes back to the classical Greek and Roman times, and people were trained to be a good public speaker, to be an orator. And they had to do several things. They had to write their speech. They had to think of the subject first, write it, put it together in an order where they knew they would persuade the audience that they were right. It had to sound eloquent and beautiful. They weren't allowed to talk about bad things. And then they had to memorize it. And then when it came to the day, the performance, they did it from memory. Now, that was the ancient art of oratory. And in the Renaissance, it was sort of dug up, rethought, and it was attached to music. And so many books about music say there's nothing like it. If you make music without being an orator, it's nothing. And it was the model behind everything. Now, with the lute, we have, like the guitar, so our one common thing between the two was is we pluck a note and it dies immediately. So we can't sustain. But the sound, one or two books say that the sound of the lute is very much, of all instruments, like speaking. So the whole idea of rhetoric is that we want to speak on our instruments rather than sing or shout. We can certainly dance, but it's going to have an element of speaking. Now, the other little image that I carry with me is the wooden painted Russian dolls that you have a big one, so that's the whole piece. You take it apart and you get the next size. That might be a different movement. And you break it down to the very smallest one, which won't come apart. And I'm going to keep that image with us while we sort of talk through and listen to some important things about making music. So we always want to keep the final, complete dole intact. I'm going to read you from 3 books, all to do with Baroque music, and 2 of them to do with the lute. But I'll start with the first one from Quantz, who was the flute teacher for Frederick the Great. He worked with C.P. Bach. He would have met Johann Sebastian Bach when Bach went there and started to write the the musical offering. Let's remember this is an English translation, but it was originally written in German. Now, Quantz says in his book about playing the flute, in chapter 11, he says, music is nothing but an artificial language through which we seek to acquaint the listener with our musical ideas. And then he says, musical execution may be compared with the delivery of an orator. So we could sum up the whole of lesson of today of that. But he says more. He says, the orator and the musician have at the base the same aim in regard to both preparation and the final execution of their productions, namely to make themselves masters of the hearts of their listeners, to arouse or still their passions, and to transport them then now here and now to this sentiment, now to another. So masters of the art of the hearts of the people listening. So to persuade that these 3 notes have a particular feeling, and if I play them differently and I want to express anger, I'll do it completely differently in my fingers. Quantz also says something interesting when we think of political climate today. He says, a piece sung or played by 2 different people may produce quite different effects. So there's it has to be this way, it has to be that, but it's a background of ideas and approaches to the music, and everybody would play differently then, and as we can now. And then Quantz goes on to say what the best qualities of an orator were. As to the delivery of an orator, we demand that he have an audible, clear, and true voice, that he have distinct and perfectly true pronunciation. Of course, that's obvious, and we don't want to hear anybody mumbling. That he aim at a pleasing delivery in voice and language, that he avoid monotony, and even that is an affect when we go and hear somebody play and we're bored. So it's a bored affect. Rather, allowing the time of the syllables and words to be heard, now loudly, now softly, now quickly, now slowly. And there are so many, that's the end of Quantz's quote, but there are so many other things. If we think of a good speech, it will have silence, it will have punctuation. And punctuation is something that we have to consider. And we've all been through a modern training, and certainly on the violin and the guitar I was taught to join everything together to make all my fingers sound the same. And as it were, one of the big differences between the 2 planets is on the lute planet, we want things to sound, notes to sound different. And in speech, even for the last 5 minutes while I've been talking, there's up and down, we have consonants and vowels. We have the ends of the sentences, we'll have the break, we'll have a comma, a full stop, and so on. We have to find that in the music. Maybe the first really foreign idea for most of us is that they talked of good and bad notes. It's not a pejorative term, it's just the good notes were the ones on the strong beats, and the bad notes, the ones between. And if we take the idea of the wooden painted doll and break it down, if we had 1 note per bar, that's going to be a good note. But if we have 2 in a row, 2 bars in a row, depending on the harmony, the second note still might be quietly good. But the good and bad ideas existed for at least 200 years before Bach. On the Renaissance lute, they would finger it differently, and the good notes were played with the thumb, and the bad notes with the index. So you get a much stronger differentiation between the good and the bad. But the idea of things being different, strong and weak, and in the world we have so many opposites, that existed in rhetorical music of the 18th century. And the second, maybe foreign idea, or certainly important one to lute players and other musicians, of course, playing Baroque music, is the idea of articulation. It was a subject that used to frighten me when I was initially playing lute and guitar. I didn't actually know what it meant. And it simply means how we produce our notes. Relating it to speaking, it's like, what's the quality of the consonants, the beginnings of the notes and the ends, and what's the quality of the vowels? Can we get a phrase to sing where there's almost no consonants? Or if we want to accent one particular note, we might stop the last of the bad notes, that one, so that one feels stronger. Now, coming back to real music and bringing some of those ideas, if we take the theme of the fugue in G minor by Bach, which was originally written for the violin, and we just listen to the theme, and I'm going to play it really badly first, at least in that planet's world idea. So I'm hopefully exaggerating. I did it all with my appuyando with my index finger. We never use appuyando really on the lute. And every note is the same. I'm going to do it again badly. So every note is articulated the same and with the same heaviness. Now, when we see the beginning of the fugue, the way that Bach has written, it's in cut time, so it's 2 beats in a bar. And meter, for Baroque musicians, was very important. If we backtrack to 60 years ago, to the conductors such as Otto Klemperer, he was renowned for his slow tempi. And if we go and listen to what they did now, the heaviness of the way that people loved hearing Bach then made the music twice as long sometimes. And there's a lot of disregard of the meter, and there are always a place in a book from the 18th century about meter and what it means. So we have 2 beats in a bar, 1, 2, and our theme starts after 1, so we already start with a bad note. And the 4th note of these reiterated Ds, that's the first really good note. The others come in pairs, bad, good. I'm not thinking of good and bad when I play because it's part of me now, but I don't think of repeated the same. So now when we have 16th notes, that's almost like an ornament because it's so far away from the beat. And if we went to a 3rd planet where I played all the notes short, then they will all still be the same, at least in the repeated Ds. That was an extreme idea to play several notes the same and short, and we do get it marked sometimes, but it's certainly not in this particular theme that we're thinking about. Taking that as an idea of what do lute players do with their right hand, or maybe even with their left hand, we have a few books that mention the idea of dampening the strings. Thomas Mace in England in 1676, he called it the tut, and he describes it very well. He says you play the note and you immediately put your finger back on it again, ready for the next note. And 2 or 3 other sources in France talk about the étouffé, where you dampen the strings. That's all we get, plus the general idea that we have to play like an orator. So Ernest Gottlieb Baron, who knew Weiss and wrote a book about the lute in 1727, He also writes about Bach and Handel. He was just in there with everybody, and he wrote the very first sort of history of the lute. And he says, this is for lute players, the practice or execution of music occurs in two ways. The first consists of playing the notes and melody just as they're written on the paper. So that's the idea. We have notation, but we can't be fundamentalist about it. With no concern for gallant additions that will press upon the emotions. So we can't make more of it to make the audience feel something. That's the first way. And this method we will leave to the artists of the lowest caliber. Now that's even the way I just said that is an attempt to be rhetorical, because I wanted to emphasize lowest. And I didn't go up, I went down and I waited, and it's like I put an underlining on the lowest. So this method we'll leave to the artists of the lowest caliber. And this manner is simple, noisy, and affects only common and uncultivated temperaments. Thus, it's out of place at court. And of course, he's a snob. And everybody at court was. But in a way, when we listen to 18th century music, we have to get into that world. The other manner of playing is the correct one. So sadly, at this time, there was the right and the wrong. But in a way, we have to hear what they say. And it can quite properly be called oratory. I call it this because it agrees with the chief goal of rhetoric. If we observe the qualities of a good orator, we'll find that his achievement consists of the following: the elegance of his words, and that's something that we read a lot, that's got to sound elegant, beautiful, and the loftiness and merit of his thoughts, so well thought out themes and subjects, and the persuasion and emotions of the affects. A virtuoso musician must possess all of these qualities. So a good musician from the 18th century point of view is one who can move people the same as a good speaker does, but by playing. And a virtuoso then was somebody who could do that, not somebody who could play fast and loud, which is sort of what it's turned into these days. Another maybe difference between our two planets. Moving on towards, we're going to look at one piece of Bach and try to put all these ideas, hear it played differently. I'd like next to mention the idea of what leads us to decide how to phrase. Now, I was taught when I was a kid there are three things in music: harmony, melody, and rhythm. And I think that in Baroque music, harmony should be at the top of the list. And I promise to play and show you why. Not that rhythm is still important, and of course melody is, but harmony affected everything. I remember reading that Django Reinhardt, the jazz guitarist, used to say that Baroque music was like jazz, that it all comes from the bass. In the 19th century, and I've played 19th century music, it's so much to do with the top voice. And that's why there's one of my little pet peeves that I hear lute players do when we have a two-note chord. I'm just playing an octave. If we're more in a modern planet, we'll go, and of course that separates it and it gives an emphasis to the top note. Now that was an ornament, and we can use it, but in the right place. So if I do that, I want to make sure the bass is fully there and the treble after. So that's one thing that we can listen for. In terms of leading our phrasing, harmony is it. Now, I'm going to take two little passages from the Prelude, Fugue, and Allegro of Bach, just the opening theme, and I'm going to play it in two ways. One, as it's written, so we can remind ourselves what it sounds like, and then let's consider what the harmony is, and can that help us know how to phrase. So in the prelude of the Prelude, Fugue and Allegro, if we think about meter, it's in 12/8. That's 4 beats in a bar, and according to the hierarchy of the bar that they were using then, 1, 2, 3, 4. And taking that, let's hear the first 4 bars. Now, the chief moment that comes to me whenever I hear that is this big dissonance. And we have the following harmonic structure. If I just play it as chords, we have a 5/3 on the first beat beginning of the piece with a bass note. The pedal stops and we just have this 6/4. Then we go back, maybe less, we're already by the second bar, and then so that's the strongest harmony on the fourth beat. And then we get again to the tonic with a passing note, a 6, and then that leads us, that inner line, to a 6/4-2 chord, which in modern terms is a dominant 7th in 3rd inversion. So it's F major with an E flat in the bass, which knocks us off the pedal. Now, okay, well, we can understand that, but it's part of what can help us decide how to phrase. After the 6/4-2 chord, it goes to this resolution of the B flat major 1st inversion, and then we have a cadence. And then this chord is one of Bach's favorite for something special, which is a 9/7. It's not just a dominant 7th, but it's one with a 9. Then he gives us only 2 voices there. So in terms of colours or the painted dolls, there are about 4 or 5 of them all mixed together to form that first phrase. So we have, and the harmonic rhythm gets faster and takes us, oh, we have to leave the pedal. And then sort of warm and rich. Then we're off again, of course, and we hear it at several different levels.